We must admit that we do not have the situation under control. I wanted to act as if the house was on fire. Because it is.
Welcome to The World We Want, Youth Voices on Climate and Health. My name is Jonathan Foster, and on this podcast I speak to youth leaders and activists, not only about the reality of our current environmental and health crisis, but also about the possibilities, alternatives and ideas for transformation and for change. We find out what youth activists are doing, and we find out what you could do to help build the world we want.
We must stop playing with words and numbers because we no longer have time.
Hello. Now imagine for a moment that you were 22 years old and a member of the UN's Youth Advisory Group on climate change, which means that you would have a direct line to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. What would you say to him? And imagine that you were the advocacy manager of an organisation called Youth and Environment Europe, and you were the co-founder of Generation Climate Europe, as well as the only young member of the European Environmental Bureau. So, what would you do with all of that access and responsibility? Well, for Nathan Metenier, there's no need to imagine, because that is his reality. In this 5th episode of The World We Want, I'm going to speak to Nathan about his ideas for change. And you might be surprised about what he has to say. You might imagine that if you've reached such dizzy heights at the age of 22, you might not want to rock the boat. After all, you're benefiting from the system, so best to try and protect the status quo. Well, not Nathan. But before I speak to Nathan, here's a thought experiment to get us in the right frame of mind, or, more to the point, to get us out of our frame of mind. So yesterday I was walking through Gamla stan in Stockholm, Sweden. Now, Gamla stan means Old Town, but of course it wasn't always known as the Old Town, because in the past it wasn't old, it was just the town. Walking through Gamla stan means actually walking through a physical manifestation of the way people thought in the past. Now here's what I mean. The architecture, the buildings and the streets in Gamla stan are all a reflection of the social structures, the behaviours, the institutions and the technologies of their time. The streets are narrow because they were built for pedestrians. Yes, there were horses and carts, but only a few people owned such things, so the narrow streets reflected the social behaviour and economic distribution. And the street names reflected economic behaviours as well. Skomakargatan, or the Shoemaker's Street, is where people made and sold shoes. Fisketorget, or Fisherman's Square, is where, you guessed it, people bought or sold fish. So when I took my walk through Gamla stan yesterday, I was actually walking through a physical manifestation of the lives of people from the past. I was walking through their technology, through their ways of thinking, their social structures. There it was, all around me, the internal landscapes of human social behaviour built into external material form. So what about today? The cities we build and the social institutions we design today are all a reflection of the internal landscapes of our minds. Today's world is the physical manifestation of our way of thinking, because just like the people who built Gamla stan, we're building a world that reflects our institutions, our technologies, our social structures, and our values and principles. And just like them, we are building on top of the past, taking from the past and adding to it to create a future. Now the problem is that the world we live in today is in big trouble. There is something about the way we think that puts our external world in danger. The climate emergency, mass extinctions, the health crises, these are all a reflection of our current internal mindscapes. Now, you might say that this is obvious. I mean, yeah, we all know that society reflects the way people think. So why am I going on about it? Well, because the challenge we're facing is the challenge of changing our minds, the challenges of adapting our internal thinking to our external world. And we've discovered it's not as easy as we imagine. There's something holding us back. Edward O. Wilson, a Harvard professor of sociobiology, was once asked if humans could solve the crisis we are currently confronting, and he answered by saying, yes, if we're honest and smart. The real problem, he said, of humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Now, there's not a huge amount we can do straight away about our Paleolithic emotions, but we can improve our medieval institutions, and that way we can get a grip on our godlike technologies. But that means taking a good, hard look at the way we think and making some honest and smart choices. And that's what youth leaders like Nathan are asking for, to change the power structures within the institutions that we have today so that we don't go on building a world in danger and instead build the world we want, so that in the future there'll be a Gamla-stan for them too. Hi Nathan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Jonathan?
So I started by asking Nathan to tell me a little bit about where he grew up and how he first got involved in climate activism. How did he start his journey?
Yeah, I grew up in the Alps, in the mountains, the French Alps, not so far from Italy. I remember our school was like in front of this absolutely amazing landscape. So I guess I've always been involved, like, like small stuff, like at school. I've always been quite aware of those issues. But I think what struck me the most was during COP21. So in Paris, 2015. So I was 15, and I was in a high school, so in the suburb of Grenoble. So I was then studying in the city, and I was like, there's this going on, it's so important, maybe we can get an agreement. I wasn't understanding what was going on, but I knew it was important. I knew it was great for what I had observed, right? Like the climate crisis around me. And I thought, let's do like a climate week or like a small COP21 in my high school. And I think that's the first time I had to like lobby different people, making sure like I wanted some kind of civil society, not just scientists coming, and I had to lobby everyone. And the school was like, no, we can't have these people. This is like, not neutral. And so I was like, why is it not neutral? And, I think at that moment, I actually went through a lot of different things that I've been doing for the past 6 years, at a very different level. And at the end, what I also realized is that, I've not understood the climate crisis as, science issue or as biodiversity as a climate issue, but much more as a social justice issue. And I've always linked those dimensions together in all the different initiatives I've led. So yeah, I guess that's how I got into it. And then at the university, I was kind of involved in different initiatives. I also studied in Scotland, and then that's how the whole kind of youth climate movement, the youth climate movement had existed, but I think I had never realized that what I was going in my communities during those years, so from like, being 15 to 19, well, there was actually young folks doing exactly the same almost everywhere in the world. And I think that has been one of the most passionating thing. And for me, that's, when people say like, what do you think about Greta? What do you think about the Greta Effect? And I think that's the Greta Effect. It's just kind of this realization that my eco-anxiety and my action in my communities while some others were doing it everywhere at the same time. And I think that was really, really something that really kind of empowered me. And that's where I realized that there's actually not just local networks, but there's also national networks, and there's like European networks, international networks. And then that's how I got involved in all of this, and then did like a lot of different stuff with different regions and institutions. And yeah.
I love that idea that the Greta Effect is about understanding that there are networks of other people feeling exactly the same way you do. It's like a family you didn't even know you had. Okay, so that brings me to the idea you mentioned that tackling the climate crisis is more than just a question of science. It's really a social issue, right? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely, I mean, for sure. Well, first, of course, the climate crisis and not just mitigation. It's not just about removing CO2. It's not just about not taking a car. It's not just about stopping your footprint and so on. I think it's much, much bigger than this, because what we realized is that those who are the most impacted are also those who have been usually the most discriminated against in history, those who have always been marginalized in history. And so we're realizing that a lot of different things we're doing in tackling the climate crisis is actually putting even more on those who are the most marginalized. And this is true for example, taxes, eco taxes. We've seen with the yellow vest, like, let's do this. But then who is eating the most? Those who have to take car, and usually in rural areas is the poorest, those who have to drive most, and therefore they're the most impacted. And I think that's really is what we call the white environmentalism. It's this perspective on solving the climate crisis by looking at it from a very kind of energy/climate change perspective. And then to answer your question, then therefore, if you're not placing yourself in this dynamic, but rather in a kind of much more comprehensive understanding of the issue, understanding that the social and the kind of environmental are completely linked, then it really changes everything, I think, because then you also consider the work you're doing in a very different way. And for example, what I've noticed in the youth climate movement is that we pay a lot of attention to making sure that everyone is feeling safe, that there's a lot of diversity, that is very inclusive, that there's a lot of well-being. Of course, this is not always happening, but I think it's because we share this vision of also different society and this system change. And for example, one of the organizations I'm involved in, called Youth for Nature, is a completely horizontal organization. And I think that really shows how, and it's a challenge, of course, every week, every day, every month, but still it shows that we also have a different vision of what we want to achieve and how we want to achieve it. So it's not just about the what, but it's also about the how. And I've seen that in many different organizations, many different groups. And I think this is fascinating. This is, for me, also bringing a new kind of proposal on how we want to do things in society, in community, right? Like together.
So in the youth climate movement, as you say, there's a vision for a different society with more diversity and better representation. And you yourself have thought about the internal structure of institutions in order to bring that about. You just mentioned Youth for Nature being a horizontal organization. So recognizing the internal structure and diversity inside any institution has an effect on how it can impact the external world, and you want to change those things. Can you expand a bit on this idea?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, like those who have been impacting them. So I think the first kind of understanding is those who are the most impacted are often those who have been the most marginalized. So this is true, for example, with indigenous people. It's true also with small islands. I mean, if you look at the AOs, this group, it's actually super interesting because most of them have also been colonized islands. And therefore, it's not just that, sea is rising. It's also that sea is rising for islands that have been systematically colonized by kind of global north countries, and therefore they don't have the infrastructure because they've been maintained in this relationship of power where they often have very high debt. So why is a heat wave hitting so hard some of these islands, it's also because based on this colonial relationship, they didn't have the means, to adapt, to get developed enough and so on. So I think that's the first understanding, is looking at how the history, the kind of colonial power relationship have impacted and are impacting some places much more than elsewhere. But I think another understanding of this kind of conversation around intersectionality and the kind of combination between social and climate justice is, of course, looking at two things. First, who has been doing all of that during all those years? Well, it's always been male, but it's also always been white male. And this is the kind of additional layer I bring, is I also think it's straight white male, because I do think that white male who are LGBTQI plus are a bit in a different category. And I think this is also where we need more diversity. So it's not just about also, kind of looking at this colonial power relationship and who is impacted the most, but it's also looking at who's done it. And I think when you look today, who's still in power everywhere, it's white male, straight. And I think that's really something we should look at. And I think that's why we're not just asking for, more climate action and so on. We're also asking for diversity. We're also asking for different leaders. And what I think is a very pragmatic way to look at this is actually from a kind of election point of view. Everyone say there's no trust in the institutions. People do not trust institutions. But at the end of the day, if there's no trust in the institutions, it's also because people cannot recognize themselves in these specific institutions. And I think this is really true. When you look at the European Parliament, it's so overwhelmingly wide. When you look at the environmental movement in Europe, it's so overwhelmingly wide. And I think it really takes a different kind of approach to who is making the law, who is getting elected, and so on. And I think, for example, personally, I'm convinced that one of the most powerful things we could do today is getting our AOCs in Europe. So making sure that we have some amazing leaders from amazing marginalized communities getting elected and representing those folks and those perspectives to the highest level. And that's the work we do at Youth and Environment Europe. Of course, we're an NGO, so we're not doing it, we're not like training people to run for campaigns or anything. But what we're doing is making sure that young folks from every single community in Europe, not just the EU, not just Western Europe, everywhere. So we're also talking about the Baltic Sea. We're talking also about the Black Sea, about the Balkans, about Russia, and so on, making sure that those voices and perspectives can get represented, and some young folks from these communities can get empowered and understand also and bring those perspectives to the highest level. So yeah.
Could I ask you what you think about something I'm going to call the chicken and egg problem? And by that, I mean, in order to get people to trust institutions more, and for institutions themselves to be able to tackle the various crises better, where would you like to have the most impact first? On the people who hold power, or on the values and principles that those people in power hold?
Mm-hmm. But I think those who can change those values, and let's call it like the neoliberal kind of understanding of how society could work. I don't just think it's just capitalism. I think it goes in every kind of ways we behave, we interact, we build society, and we just are together in general. I think to change those values and principles, you need to have different kind of people in power and coming from different kind of roots and kind of categories of societies. And I think that would then change those values and principles, because I think there is much more empathy. There is a much bigger understanding of what it means to, suffer, what it means to be on the side, to be discriminated. And I think when we've experienced that, if you're in position of power, then you will change things. You will make sure that then there's not just a small groups of people who get absolutely everything, and then we're all struggling on the side and not knowing if we'll be able to kind of not lose our homes and not lose our islands, culture. We talk a lot about loss and damage, by the way, which I think is so interesting. It's not just like losing your home, you're losing your property, but it's also like the thing we can't count, like culture, language, all these things that are so important to identity as well. So yeah, I think that's what we need to change those values. I don't think they can be changed in any other ways than by having different people also in power.
Okay, so there is a structural problem there within the institutions that wield power. So how do you see change happening? What kind of mechanism could you envisage that would help to make institutions more representative? Because I mean, to play devil's advocate just for a moment, one thing that many institutions are very good at is reproducing themselves, right?
So far, the way I get around this question is by thinking that if we had stronger, more organized communities, civil society groups, kind of, organized civil society, really embedded in social justice principle, kind of, what we call climate justice, like looking at the climate crisis through the lenses of social justice. I think we can really get more from our states if we have some kind of very well-organized civil society communities that are embedded in climate justice principles. Because I think that what it would do is it would show to everyone that actually we can really bring together the kind of, all those groups fighting for social justice and all those groups fighting for like more conservation or whatever. And I think that would be really powerful in pushing our states and showing our states that anything you do, which is one, sustainable, and second, socially fair, then it's great for everyone. It's great for, those who are struggling the most in our societies, and it's great for, the planet. And I think that would actually drive a really good agenda. And then the states would be more willing to, get together, maybe G7 setting, and then say, okay, let's tax those billionaires, because clearly that's not okay. So that's why I'm just thinking that in our theory of change, I don't see any other way than having extremely well-organized and strong civil society fighting for climate justice. And therefore, not just asking for more climate action or conservation, because that makes absolutely no sense if you're not at the same time trying to tackle world's inequalities and those issues of, wealth and so on.
Great. So raising awareness and changing the internal power structures within institutions and so forth is apparently vital. But I'm wondering if we could bring the conversation around a little bit so that we don't only talk from a top-down perspective. There's a lot of people I'm thinking about who don't come from privileged backgrounds, who don't go to universities, who don't spend their time in the circles that make decisions, but spend their time in the places where those decisions affect them. What do you say to those people? How do you encourage them to engage in the processes that will bring about the changes that you're talking about?
Yeah, and as you said, like policies that affect them, but also where policies have to be implemented, right? So I guess it's communities, and especially the most marginalized, are the most affected, but also the more the one who can gain the most from, kind of climate inclusive, fair climate policies. Well, you know how much this is important for me, and it's so much at the core of the work I do at Youth and Environment Europe. Youth and Environment Europe was created in the 80s, and it's always had a very strong membership in the Balkans and in the Black Sea region. And so it's always driven a very kind of social understanding of the climate crisis, of the environmental crisis, which is so interesting. And what we're doing right now is we're doing two things. First, we're looking at what's going on in the ground and showcasing this work. So we showcase the work of like amazing activists from like marginalized communities all around Europe that are doing, amazing things to tackle the climate crisis in their communities and so on. So kind of giving them the fair share of kind of global coverage and so on. We have an amazing partnership with Euronews where we showcase every month an amazing story. And what we do is also supporting our members, supporting those groups financially financially to do their work. So for example, what we're going to start very soon this year is supporting financially groups that work with Roma communities, for example, on the climate crisis, or supporting a French youth organization to work more with rural youth and kind of understanding how they can work together, supporting work in conservation, for example, in Albania, and making sure that, you know, young folks have support and so on. And I think that's how, by supporting very targeted kind of grassroots action on the ground that are inherently working on climate justice, we can bring about change in the communities, in the cities, in the states, and all of that. And I think that's really bringing everyone together.
So when we bring everyone together and create the kinds of changes you want, what will the world look like? What kind of a world will we end up with?
Yeah, I guess I'd love a world where, like, kind of first elites and so on wouldn't go right away in like consulting firms and, like, you know, all these jobs and so on, because it's so sad that so many amazing people, instead of like working in climate justice and environmental justice, they go working for this big consulting firm just because that's the only one where you get like a fair kind of, you know, like living and so on. Exactly, yeah. Money. So that's pretty sad, because I think it comes back again to the question of funding and so on. And, you know, it's related also to debt, right? Like when you're a student, you have so many debts and loans, like you have then to make money. And where do you make money? In the worst jobs? Like, it's just like, again, like we're all completely closed. And there's a couple that can like avoid, but why can they avoid that? Either because they haven't studied, either because they're already wealthy, right? And they don't have loans and debts. So that would be a third thing. I think it's very concrete as well thing, but it's, I think, a big issue. And of course, what I love to see as well is much more, as I said, much more funding for climate justice work, because I really believe that climate justice is the way forward. And you know, I was reading this weekend that many of the American founders in the past years have been increasing their funding to nuclear power research and nuclear power kind of community organizing, and making sure that in the US or other countries, there's more funding that goes for this. And, you know, I just find that so sad that, like, because we're not able to get together and think about these issues from like a kind of more holistic perspective, the only kind of solution we have is like to invest in nuclear power to decarbonize our economy. Like, this is so sad to me, because it's not solving any problem. It's just postponing them. There will still be social inequalities. There will still be the climate crisis. There will still be biodiversity destruction. And I think this is very sad. So I'd love a world where we're looking at reducing our energy, especially in the global north, especially the wealthiest, instead of just looking for different sources, so that we can just keep exactly as we're doing, just with another kind of source of energy. And maybe last, I think I'd love to see a couple of like amazing leaders that are very much focusing on empathy, well-being, and you know, I'm not a big fan of like saviors who are gonna come and so on. So I wish there will be less ego and we can get together. And I think we just need women to lead that, and that would be better.
Well, yeah, well, I definitely like that idea, Nathan. Yeah, good. And thank you so much for your time again. And thank you for your work and your intellectual curiosity, and for getting yourself involved in this important work. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. Thanks very much, and goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Take care.
To find out more about Youth for Nature, go to www.youth4nature.org. That's 4 with the number 4. youth4nature.org. So there you go. How can we make sure that the Gamla stans of the future reflect an inclusive set of values and principles that represent the whole spectrum of beautiful expressions of the human experience? Of course, to achieve this, you can't just walk through this metaphorical town, you have to build it too, because everything we do today shapes tomorrow. So, what are you going to do today? Thanks for listening.
We must stop playing with words and numbers, because we no longer have time.
This podcast is brought to you by the Prince Mahidol Award Conference in collaboration with the Swedish Institute for Global Health Transformation, FHI 360, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the British Medical Journal, USAID, and Jonathan Foster